We will be going live in just about half a minute. Hello, and welcome to the IFA's post-15th Global Conference on Aging, thematic discussions among experts, the first of 4 webinars in the series. A gentle reminder, the webinar is recorded and streamed live on the IFA Facebook page. This webinar begins with brief remarks from 2 expert speakers, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. Please use the Q&A function along the bottom of your screen to pose any questions or post comments for today's speakers, and Dr. Barratt, as moderator, will read them out to the speakers during the moderated discussion. Following the webinar, relevant resources will be posted on the IFA website. Now it is my pleasure to pass the floor to the Secretary General of the IFA, Dr. Jane Barratt.
And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much, Rashmi, for the introduction. The International Federation on Aging aims to drive the world's population agenda in alignment with the UN Decade of Healthy Aging 2021 to 2030, and improve the experience of aging through information sharing, education, and the opportunity for us all to connect with colleagues around the world. The IFA 15th Global Conference, which was held in November 2021, was aligned with the 4 action areas of the decade: long-term care, age-friendly environments, ageism, and primary integrated care. In recognition of the exceptional calibre of content presented at the 15th Global Conference, the IFA is very proud to be partnering with the AARP to develop a series of webinars. But these webinars are really digging deep into some of the important areas of our age-friendly environment. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, a speaker that's known to many of us around the world, a great friend and a great colleague, and a great leader in her field, Catherine McGuigan. Let me just tell you a little bit about Catherine, and as you can imagine, her portfolio of qualifications and experience expands greatly. But Catherine, she's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Age-Friendly Ireland Program. And this is a shared service hosted by Meath County Council on behalf of the local government sector. That's a really unique model that I hope that Catherine is going to talk about. The municipality-led national program, and I want to say that again, it's a municipality-led national program, is based on the WHO Global Age-Friendly Program and is operational across all of the 31 local authority areas in Ireland. The program is focused on ensuring Ireland is responsive to the increasing needs of older people, and adopting effective local policy approaches to respond to demographic ageing. I think what we have seen around the world is age-friendly programs, and predominantly, those programs that are mature and sophisticated in their pulling through from local to national, in their responsive and dynamic approach to the needs of older people in COVID. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce and thank Catherine for being part of this important webinar. The floor is yours, Catherine.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks so much for those lovely warm words, and welcome to my colleague Stephanie from AARP. I'm delighted to be here today and share some insight, because just beforehand we were talking just about all the different, I suppose, things that are going on in the world, and yet all this progressive work towards supporting people as they age is happening in tandem. And I think that's the way of the future. Today's theme is very, very timely in as much as some of the recent milestones we've had in the programme, but I just wanted to take a little bit of a back step and talk to you in terms of what Jane was referring to, I suppose, the context and the rationale and a little background, because I think that's important, Jane, in terms of where the shared service is now and how it's had traction in terms of delivering health and well-being outcomes, particularly in the context of the built environment, which they're not mutually exclusive and very intertwined, but you wouldn't ordinarily think of the two hand in hand when you're starting this process. So Age Friendly Ireland, just very briefly, started back in response to the WHO's global framework and checklist of 2006-2007, and actually Ireland participated in the study across the 33 cities across the world in terms of determining that framework. So work had really started in Ireland around 2006 and 2007. But in essence, the first programme in Ireland was launched in 2008 through the local authorities. However, the national programme, which was coordinating and looking at our sort of support to replicate and bring some level of consistency, went through a number of iterations. It was housed in an organisation called the Ageing Well Network. It was philanthropically funded. Then it was sort of led by local government, rolled out through local government, but funded by departments in tandem with philanthropic funding. But I guess as we progress through this municipality-led approach, which I'll talk to a little bit about later, at the end of 2016, a decision was made when the philanthropic funding ended that it needed to go into a more permanent home. And in that regard, under the 2014 Reform Act in Ireland, under our programme for government, shared services were delivered. So shared services are basically where the local authority sector, which in Ireland, local government delivers over 100 services across planning, roads, environment, housing, community, economic development, emergency services. So as a coordinating function, they were taking the lead in one of these shared services. And there are 31 local authorities in Ireland across 26 counties. So 4 local authorities bid for that process, and one won the bid to host the age-friendly programme. And therefore it had a more, I suppose, home that was, I suppose, anchored in the local government sector and was going to be there for a sustainable length of time. So when we moved into that, the shared service became the coordinating function for all the 31 local authority programmes. However, I suppose their implementation had never wavered, and there were a few core principles around that. And I think, Jane, you sort of touched on it there. The municipality-led means at grassroots level, what did we do differently? Well, first of all, we decided to ask older people what was important to them. And instead of a bunch of service providers sitting around and saying, well, we know what's important as you age, we actually went and we found the authentic voice of older people. Because older people are not an homogenous group, we didn't go to one particular sector that were active or inactive or had certain abilities or disabilities or were from rural or urban areas. We went and we found that collective voice and that diverse voice. And even bringing those people together to talk together could sometimes present challenges because it had never been done before. So over the last 12 years, we've consulted with 30,000 older people, the length and breadth of Ireland, but we've also brought those people to the strategic table to sit across from chief executives and senior personnel in our health services to actually say to them, it's not great like this. Could we do it like this? And could we prioritize this? And we call that our co-design, which was built on a design and build ethos. If it didn't work, we'd knock it down and start again. And as a result of that, we've delivered about 12,000 initiatives, which I'm going to talk to you about today. And of those 12,000 initiatives, many of them have been mainstreamed and embedded into policy, which is, I suppose, the core coordinating function of shared service. What we do as a national body now is we will, first of all, have strong local healthy age-friendly programs, which are healthy alliances, healthy older people's councils, performing managers that are able to implement the actions in their local strategies, and I suppose put policy into practice. The second objective that we look at is scaling up and replicating. So again, looking at those, well, what has worked and what has worked really well? What do we need to ensure is embedded in funding so that it can be scaled up? And also make sure that if it's not working, why it's not working or why it didn't have impact. The third is to measure and monitor and sort of look at those, not just our outputs and our metrics, but the outcomes. What impact did we have? And in that regard, we have delivered 76 baseline indicators at both national and rural level, which we can use as a tool to measure the impact of initiatives and, I suppose, successful models. And the fourth one then is policy. And that means that we can, through our National Governance Board, we work with government. We work with, we don't lobby or we don't go up with the problems. We go up with the solutions and say, look, this has worked really well. And similarly, in that regard, we advise on what doesn't necessarily work. So if governments are actually putting money into services that may not proactively support older people as they age, we're advising on that at local level. So that's the basis of which the shared services operate. And at local level, we have 31 age-friendly program managers, and we have 31 age-friendly technical advisors who are either engineers or architects and support housing delivery and planning delivery at local level. And I suppose for a team of around 90 people working directly into the service, it's producing a lot of outputs. So that's just the background and the context to where we are today. And it's working very well. And I suppose I'm always trying to work with our colleagues through the WHO and through Jane and Stephanie or other colleagues to say it is a good model because it's sustainable and it works very, very well. So the local government approach has worked very, very well for us. That doesn't mean that it will work in every country, but it has certainly worked for us. But there's also learning within that that can be translated to other countries. So in terms of the outputs in the built environment, and everything comes back, I suppose, if you look at person-centric care to the health and well-being. And what does that mean to an older person? An older person, we developed about 9 outcomes that we actually aligned to the 8 domains within the WHO. And there that people would have adequate income. They would be able to have access to services, whether that's access through transport or access through the system. That they would be able to get services in a timely way, whether that's going to the shop, or getting a hospital appointment, or getting an operation, or whatever the case may be, that they would have adequate housing, that they would feel safe and secure, that they could get out and about, and that everything was accessible to them and barriers weren't in place, and so forth. But all of those outcomes come back to one positive thing, is that their latter years would be healthy aging years. Nobody has, we have a great, aspirations toward we're living beyond in our 80s. Every child that was born since 2002 will live to maybe 100 years of age, or 50% of the males, and the statistic change and projections grow. But what does that mean? What if you're not well? What if you can't access services? What if you're relying on family to get from A to B? What if you're in the house and you're isolated? It's really, really important that your latter years are healthy years, and everything relates back to that. So in the context of the built environment, we had a vision, and we've in our policy, our programme for government of 2020, there's a vision of an age-friendly Ireland. And what does that mean? And age friendliness is anchored in Glenn Miller's quote that we always use in all of our publications. If you design for the young, you exclude the old. If you design for the old, you can include everyone. And what that means is, with the wisdom of years, at some stage in your life, you've went through many, many things. You might have been had an injury, you might have had access issues, you might have had children, you might have been a carer, you might have lived in rural areas, urban areas. You bring a wealth of knowledge in your later years. So what we have designed is, when we have a vision that everywhere in Ireland will be age-friendly. So that means no matter where you go, you will have an age-friendly perspective. So when we do a 4-stage process, we will consult with older people. We will look at a building or a public park or an institution and ask them to do a walkability audit, which is a tool. And all of these resources, Jane, are available on our website, which we can share afterwards. And you can do your walkability audit and then come back collectively with recommendations. What should we do to change this? And then those actions are implemented, and then they're recognized as an age-friendly institution, or whatever the case may be. So in Ireland to date, we've had 55 age-friendly towns, which means those towns have looked at public realm works like pedestrian crossing, pavements, age-friendly parking. There are 255 age-friendly parking spaces across the country at the moment. We have 2,500 age-friendly businesses. We have 150 age-friendly libraries. We have our first age-friendly train station coming up, and our first age-friendly tourist destination, and just about to launch 2 age-friendly airports. We have our first age-friendly hospital in St. Luke's in Kilkenny, and we have age-friendly primary care centres in Wicklow and Kildare. So that means that all of those institutions have went through a process of ensuring that age friendliness is built into them. And when we say it like that, it sounds like, that's great. There's a huge amount of work involved in making those modifications and building them in. So we're very proud, I suppose, of a lot of the work that has gone on, but coupled with that, we have accelerated the delivery of age-friendly housing, which is really, really important, and inviting in universal design principles. And Ireland is very lucky in as much as that it has the only Centre for Excellence in Universal Design in the world. And it's actually a mandated structure that's through the National Disability Authority, which provides technical guidance, again, as a resource to all countries, which actually says what it means to be universally enabled by the built environment. So we have learned from those, and we have built all of those into our toolkits and our guidance tool. And only last week, Jane, and I'll come to a close now because I know we've got 15 to 20 minutes. I'll just say that last week we had an historic event where the WHO came to Ireland and acknowledged Croke Park, which is the home of our national game, but acknowledged it as the first age-friendly stadium that has actually went through this process in the world. And that was a rigorous process of older people visiting the stadium and saying, well, how could we make it more accessible to get to? What needs to be done in the built context? But also ticketing and servicing. And if we needed some of the staff or the stewards to, enable people to get out into the stands or get to the toilets. The whole ethos has been built into the rollout of the stadium. And it was such an historic day last week. And we welcomed 13 of our age-friendly ambassadors from around the country as well, to celebrate that we have these guidelines and we have this first age-friendly stadium. And what we hope now is that all these stadia across Ireland will follow suit. But also, we'd like to see Madison Square Gardens becoming an age-friendly stadium, or we'd like to see Barcelona becoming an age-friendly stadium. So all of those guidelines are there to share. So Jane, I know in terms of timing, I'm coming to the end. I just wanted to say that all of those built environment initiatives that we have done have ultimately fed back to the overall health and well-being of older people. And in conclusion, just to let you know that all of those resources we're very happy to share and let other countries avail of that knowledge and see how they can adopt the process.
Look, thank you very much, Catherine. And I think what you have clearly stated is that this is unconditional, you're sharing. And I know that for a fact. So thank you for that. And if I can ask Rashmi to make sure that we populate the chat box or send it out to all of those on the webinar today. I want to give you a question on notice. I want you to go back in time to 2005. So the question that I'm going to ask you is, what are the 3 things that an older person would actually feel is different from 2005 to 2022 in an age-friendly Ireland? Because you started around 2008, and I certainly know what that felt like. So, perhaps if you can take that question on notice. But I also wanted to just pay tribute to this co-design model, the councils, the measuring, the monitoring, the scaling up. So you in Age-Friendly Ireland have really unpacked some of those issues that prevent sustainability in an age-friendly program. So I will come back to you on that. So thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Firestone. And Stephanie, there is no question, is a global thought leader in the area of livable communities for all people of all ages and abilities. And if we even put age-friendly to one side just for a moment, Stephanie is a senior strategic policy advisor with AARP International, where she leads global initiatives to advance the planning, design, and development of enabling and equitable housing and multi-generational communities. Stephanie collaborates with international institutions and partners, including the IFA and the World Health Organization, and leads AARP's engagement in planning for the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. Previously, and Stephanie's got a long history in this area, and that's why she's so expert and in tune. Stephanie was Director of Livable Communities at the National Association of Area Agencies, where she worked directly with area agencies, cities and counties, and developed tools for local change makers. And you can see the resonance, can't you? The importance of local. In 2015-16, she was the Health and Aging Policy Fellow, working with the American Planning Association and the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, helping local leaders think regionally. So this is the bottom-up approach again, how to create more inclusive communities and expand affordable housing. I just want to finish off by saying that Stephanie when she was working in Israel, led social and environmental justice efforts. So this whole area of age-friendly environments is actually embedded in a rights-based approach. And that's important for this week because at this very time, the UN is convening the 12th session of the Open-Ended Working Group. She founded the country's first Jewish Arab environmental non-profit organisation, and her efforts have been towards the World Summit on Sustainable Development at the UN General Assembly. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jane. It's great to always be with you and Catherine in these conversations, and welcome to everyone. I guess I'll just start by going back to what Jane was saying about COVID-19 and what we've learned. One of the things we've learned clearly is the extremely large percentage of deaths that have happened in congregate facilities means that there's even more of a push for people to age in their homes and in their communities for as long as possible. And we at AARP also run the US's age-friendly network. It's called the Network of Age-Friendly States and Communities. We now have 651 communities, and including cities and counties, as well as 9 states and the US Virgin Islands that are members of our engagement with the Age-Friendly Network. And I guess I just want to mention the housing in community and the living in the homes aspect of this. That's the kinds of things that that Catherine was talking about in terms of age friendliness. The backdrop, at least in the US and in many parts of the developed world, is that housing is designed for sort of the average height male person between the ages of 40 to 40 years old. So basically, everyone else outside of that parameter, which is most of us, needs to adapt. And so the environments, the built environment is really disabling in the way that it was created. And so we are trying to work with people who have an influence in how that built environment is created. So that's city planners and architects, designers, and developers, and people in the real estate industry. And so, age friendliness, unfortunately, is not yet a part of their typical curriculum of learning. And so really the onus is often on age-friendly community advocates to educate those folks as a critical part of their advocacy work. We developed a program called Equity by Design. It's a set of guiding principles, or sort of what are the topics that we wanted to flesh out with global experts in this space. Excuse me. And we have engaged, thousands of professionals in the space and guided a variety of conversations. I want to tell you a little bit about a few of those principles and a few just examples of that. So the first principle is called enabling design, which is a term coined by my colleague and partner in this work, Esther Greenhouse. It talks about the fact that if the environment is overly demanding, then people struggle. And yet if it's under demanding, then people don't have the ability to use their basic abilities and to function within those abilities. So those actually often can atrophy. And so in many cases, again, they are disabling those environments. This principle focuses on, which the WHO Global Network now focuses more on getting the fit right between people's needs and the environments where they live. Excuse me. So the second principle is we need to drive informed demand. So the fact is that housing has been built pretty much the same way for so long that people can only envision within a very narrow range of possibilities and housing products. And so consumers don't even really know what to ask for, and therefore there's very little demand. So that's something that we're trying to work on to develop that demand. A third area is called alleviating disparities. So again, back to the kinds of things that Jane was talking about that COVID has highlighted. So we have marginalized many groups in the United States. Older people is one, but also Black people, people of color, Native people, and immigrants. And we've basically done that in many communities in the US by physically segregating people of different ages and different racial backgrounds over a number of decades, and often then disinvesting in the places where they live. So these communities are also very frequently beset by health disparities, as well as educational and economic and environmental disparities as well. One of our dialogue experts pointed out that the people closest to the problem are often the people closest to the solution, going back to what Catherine talked about in terms of engaging all of the people of all ages, particularly older adults, in these conversations. So, so his team focused on bringing everyday people from the margins to the center of the planning processes. And one of the things that we learned through these conversations about the way to do that, or a need in order to engage residents in that space, is that it demands two important actions. One is to build the capacity of people to engage in that dialogue. So whether it's language of design and language of planning, so that they can then contribute their expertise. And the second action that's really needed is how do you democratize the data? So how do you invest in platforms that facilitate the generation of input or data from people in the community directly? And of course, you need to then make sure that those data are used in the decision making. So those were sort of a series of conversations that we had, and emerging from that, we basically were asked by a lot of our participants, so what does this look like in the field? You know, what are some good innovations that are moving the needle in this space? And so we essentially created a series of called Principles in Action, where we are really moving the needle, trying to lift up some of the pieces that are doing that. One of the other areas in equity by design is this idea of facilitating intergenerational engagement. And so, you know, we all know about ageism. That's one of the principles, the action areas of the Decade of Healthy Aging, discrimination just by age. One of the things in the built environment is that it's created in a way often that does not facilitate people to engage across generations. So that's a really important thing that we've tried to do. And one of the spaces that are most intergenerational is the housing where people live, in multi-generational housing, which in the United States was at a low in 1980 of about 12%. Before the pandemic, somewhere around 20, and now there's some estimates is up to about 26%. Now we know a lot of people moved in with relatives or with other people of different generations, largely because of economic reasons. One of my colleagues, Donna Butts, says that families often come together out of need, but they stay together by choice. And we're seeing some of the Pew Research Center does a lot of research about this, and we're seeing some of that pan out. And they're saying that there's no sign that multi-generational populations in households are going to be shrinking in it anytime soon. And so the housing, having not been built to be multi-generational, is also something that we need to concentrate on. I'll give you a couple of examples of some of the principles and action innovations that we featured. So one was from the Clarion Housing Group in the UK, which is one of the largest developers there. They deal with social housing, but they also build market rate housing in order to subsidize the social housing. And the head of their regeneration program was a part of our conversation that developed the principles. And through that conversation, they decided at this 5th largest developer in the UK, that they want to develop an age-friendly strategy. And so they did that. And they are now a developer that has 3 prongs to their strategy: to design and build schemes that enable residents to live longer, healthier, happier lives, to ensure residents have the right home at the right time, and to empower residents to shape their lives and communities no matter what age. So the second innovation I'll mention is in part because we're speaking with Catherine from Ireland, but also because it's really one of my personal favorites, which is a group called Ava Housing in Ireland, a nonprofit that essentially does some of that multi-generational work. But what they do is they take advantage of the fact that there are a lot of people, older people, living in homes that they raised families in, and that they're now living in alone. That is a huge issue in the United States. And oftentimes they might have paid off their mortgage on their home, but the taxes, the local property taxes may have gone up. They may have other costs to maintain the home that they can't afford. And they sometimes have difficulties just doing the daily or routine things like cutting the lawn or shoveling snow. And so the other issue that we've learned about even more in COVID, but we've known for quite some time, is that isolation and loneliness is a real challenge among older adults. So what they're doing at Ava Housing is they are working with a person who owns a home that they live in alone, and they are working with them to get funding to design, and they've created a few designs for a common typology of housing that was very popular in Ireland after World War II, which we found in a lot of cities in the US too. There's a typology that sort of some large percentage of housing is built upon. So that enables you to create a design, or maybe 3 or 4 types of designs for that house, and then that's not a cost that people have to deal with any longer, or a zoning issue in terms of a planning issue in terms of getting permit. And then what they've done is they then modify the ground floor of the home so that that person can age in place very, very well. And then they modify the second story of that home to enable a rental unit. And one of the wonderful things that they've also done is reached out to hospital nearby, where they may have a lot of people who are a resident in the hospital for a year or 2 years, and they're looking for a single occupancy place to live that's affordable. And so they've essentially brought in a person with incidentally some medical background into the home as a renter. So just one of my favorite examples that I love to talk about, and I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to answer questions.
Look, thank you very much, both Stephanie and Catherine. Stephanie, I just want to follow up on a couple of things that you mentioned. And, this equity by design, to what degree do you personally, because I don't want to bring in the organisation, so to what degree do you personally think that ageism plays a factor in, the design of housing for older people? And does that impact on equity?
Well, I mean, first of all, the fact is that something like 80% of the housing that people are going to live in the future has already been built. So, so a really important part of this is modification of existing housing and existing stock. Ageism is a part of that, has to be a part of that, because first of all, we haven't, we're living a lot longer nowadays. And so people are living, as Catherine talked about, and you've mentioned, the healthy living aspect is something we had not focused on when we're living so much longer. And so, without any blame, the fact that our housing was created for young people is just a fact of life. And so we need to go about and figure out how to change that. The issue of equity is, a more deeply, is very troubling and more deeply ingrained in many ways. In this country, we have had through planning decisions, through policy, really segregated the communities. As I've mentioned, we've had, through urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, we essentially knocked down a lot of the neighborhoods where particularly Black communities were living, and built up housing in sort of public housing that's really not only not age friendly, but not human friendly in many ways, with few safe spaces and green spaces to interact, certainly not across the generations. We have built highways through some primarily Black communities in this country, and destroyed some of those neighborhoods. So equity is also a really important piece that we at AARP are increasingly focused on making sure that all of our work incorporates an equity angle as well.
And of course, when we're talking about ageism, it's institutional, it's interpersonal, it's self-identifying. And I think it's really interesting how you've actually develop this understanding, a very deep understanding around, the kinds of the evolution of housing. Back in the 80s, we thought gated communities were the answer. Now we understand that gated communities actually may not be the answer because there's no one answer. So thank you. Catherine, have you come back from 2005 and tell us, how do you know that you're living in an age-friendly island now?
Yeah, I was trying to think of, what are the high-level things that have changed, and oftentimes it's very pragmatic things that are meaningful to older people. So I sort of bunched them into three, and one of them is, it goes back to the piece that Stephanie was talking about, but I'll frame it in this way. The parlance has changed in relation to aging in Ireland. So before that, we had negative stereotypes about aging. On the CSO stats, when the census form came out, you were 65 or over. Do you know what I mean? That was it. You were 65 to 100, not taking in any consideration to the complexities associated with the aging process. You had 0 to 5 and all the rest. So the whole thing that came through was that there was no real, I suppose, I feel, sort of any intense value put on the aging process. And if we look at, and Jane, I will add, that doesn't mean that everybody on the island of Ireland knows there's a great age-friendly programme. And that's okay. That's okay, because that will be something we'll always do. But if that voice is represented, or that need is represented through the Older People's Council, that's okay too. And we always strive around communicating and making sure people know. But as long as the work is in place and that voice has been represented. So if you're taking housing, for example, and what has changed, so we did a 10-step guide based on the UD principles. So looking at things like the entrance to your home, capped electrical points, I suppose modifications like wet rooms. As Stephanie says, most of our housing is built really for a bricks and mortar perspective. And now they have to look at things like energy and climate and the sustainable development goals, but also a lifetime approach that even if it's a soft wall, that you can adopt your home and later on. So that has certainly changed in Ireland from two perspectives. We're looking at retrofitting our older stock, and we're looking at future-proofing any stock that and we have a lot of housing to build in Ireland, particularly in the social capacity. So I think that has definitely changed. So parlance, I suppose the actual implementation in terms of, and that relates not just to housing, that's in terms of transport, there's initiatives and everything else. And I suppose the last thing that has really changed, I suppose, is dual. Is that as certainly as agencies, we are more aware of the aging process. And that's because older people have found a voice. And that mechanism is through the Older People's Council. So we know we have 31 of those. They're very diverse representations, but they meet collectively. And again, because the ethos of that voice is that we want to provide that voice, it's nearly seen as a great role. It's a very altruistic role. And when people come in to be part of those, they feel that they're coming up to roll up their sleeves and actually do something. So that has certainly changed. We always had volunteers, but actually volunteering to come in and provide a voice has been very, very different. So there would be the three kind of high-level bunch things, Jane, that have certainly changed in the last 17 years.
Look, thank you very much for that. I just want to go back to what healthy aging is, because I think sometimes we actually lose what it is. And the definition from WHO is it's a process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being in older age. And I'm always fascinated with this person and environment, and you cannot separate them. And I think that's a really important sort of intrinsic idea that we need to take forward and operationalise. Stephanie, we have a question from Sari. Do you think an age-friendly environment can help promote productive ageing and ageing in place? And I will add, how? So do you think it can? And then how?
Well, again, going back to the fact that people living in congregate settings are living with people who are largely their age. AARP does a lot of survey work, surveys people of all ages, but in particular older adults. And year after year, we find people want to age in their homes or in their communities for as long as possible. And people want to be in a multi-generational setting. They want to engage with other people. So if you're building segregated communities, then you're taking away the opportunity for people to continue to, as part of their healthy aging process, to continue to contribute to the community that they live in, to continue to learn, to continue to be involved through voluntary activities, to continue to work a little bit longer. All of these things are, the built environment, and we know that the about 80% of the health outcomes that someone's health is impacted by social determinants of health, as opposed to your genetic, your hereditary conditions that you may have. And so the built environment is a critical piece to enabling you to walk places, to enabling you to do exercise, to engage with other people, to have access to transportation to take you to work opportunities and other engagement opportunities, to have public spaces where you can, where there are outdoor activities that you can engage in, to be able to shop nearby and get all the access to healthy foods and access to your health care. All of those things are determined not only by a built environment, but in very much, in a very large proportion by the built environment in which you live.
And I think also that we're not saying that all older people will be able to stay in their home of choice forever and ever. I think that's really important. I think that we've actually got to recognise that our functional ability, that's both physical, social, psychological, mental, sometimes does not afford us to be living in the community. And it could be because of lack of services, but it could be that I am just safer in a more supported environment. I just want to go to Catherine. It's a question that we've received from Tracy, about the Love the Modified Home in Ireland option. Her concern is property taxes in her community are very high, and some people have moved due to lack of affordability despite having paid off their mortgage. Ordinances have to be modified to support this type of home modification. How do we make these changes happen when other residents are very concerned about increasing apartment options? Do you have a comment about that?
I beg your pardon, Jane, I was on mute. It goes back to what you were saying there about the continuum of care, and it actually talks about the subjectivity of health and well-being, which is about choice. So, an older person might want to go to the park and use the recreation area and exercise, or an older person might just want to go and sit in the park and be on their own, but be surrounded by nature. And it's all about providing those built environment opportunities. And in relation to housing, what we really never had, if you take Ireland, for example, you had your home and then you went into residential care towards end of life. So the thing that Stephanie is talking about there is the AVA housing model. On top of that, we have right sizing, which is looking at a financial contribution model and maybe selling your home back to the local authority and using a financial contribution model to go into social housing. That's one example. The property tax, for example, that we pay in Ireland for the LPT, that goes to contributing to the built environment. But there are other models, like you can get a grant for a retrospective refit of your home. Up to 30,000 to go in and do these things into your home for the private owner occupier. We've also done work with the financial services in terms of, because unfortunately policies can be quite ageist, that once you're 65, it's very unattainable to get anything beyond a bit of equity release. But then if you look at our cooperative models of credit unions in Ireland, they give loans right up to your 80. So what we have is, but how do we utilize those to give people these range of options? So you can have ancillary buildings onto what Stephanie's talking about, multi-generational homes. We have a fantastic home sharing model in Ireland, and I seen somebody put it in the chat there. That has dividends for everybody: the home sharer, the older person. You know, there are your retrofit of your own home. There is we don't call it downsizing anymore, Jane. We call it right sizing, because you might move into something that's like a duplex or an apartment. And interestingly, just on the point that was raised there, we had a right sizing scheme in Limerick where the council built 8 beautiful age-friendly houses, and they were oversubscribed by quadruple. For 32 people that were owner occupied applied for these 8 houses. But on the contrary, when they built apartments and did the same scheme, they didn't have so many applicants. So people's choice were to move into homes. And there's something associated with having space and having more than one bedroom, and looking at our models of older people's housing, which we've changed. So we're building in all of these and lifetime developments and different types of housing, and looking at things like, you know, I suppose the proximity to services, the site selection, the brownfield site, not the gated community stuck on the greenfield site 3 miles outside the town. They were moving away from all of that. And the models, we have different ones. I think there's still a work to be done on sort of saying, well, this is consistently for you if you want to right size, but we're getting there. And there are different incentives. And one thing I will say, Jane, that website that we developed with the Department of Housing and Department of Health last year looks at all those different schemes and incentives. So if people want to look at the Irish mechanisms that are in place, they're very welcome to look at those websites.
Look, thank you. And there is a wealth of resources, and I know that for AARP too, because I've actually looked at them. Look, you know, you come from very similar worlds, but very different worlds. You know, I think about Ireland and the population, and then I think about US and the population. So, Stephanie, you know, in terms of scaling up, how do you get your head around this? Because, you know, you've got over 50 states, and within states you have different, you know, electoral boundaries. How do you think about that when you're scaling up across the United States?
Well, we do a number of things. So first of all, I mean, everybody will tell you that these, you know, all these decisions are local. And so even though there's guidance, and we have a ton of tools online that are all free to download at livable.org under arp.livable.org, we know that the municipality and the local community needs to make it work for them. And you know, one of the examples that someone gave or asked about was guidance about modifying homes. So, you know, one of our guides is a home fit guide, which is a room to room guide. So we have a lot of those materials, but at the local level, every group, every organization, every municipality needs to make it right for them. So we provide from the national level, you know, we have a AARP office in every state in the US, as well as in the territories in Washington, DC. And they provide guidance also for the local governments to do their advocacy on livable communities. So we have a ton of work that's done from the national level. We also provide assistance, like technical assistance, in addition to our guidance. So we provide some technical assistance for communities, professionals in a particular space, if it's the development of accessory dwelling units or missing middle housing, like Catherine was talking about, you know, duplexes, triplexes, that kind of thing. So we provide a lot of that assistance. And then again, going back to, you know, the equity by design model and the innovations, we like to lift up global innovations that local communities, developers, that planners can take their ideas from. And I actually want to give a plug, but also to mention in this context that one of the things we rarely, if ever, talk about in livable communities is public restrooms, which not only for older people, but for older people is a major issue that prevents them from going out of the house and enjoying being in the public realm if there is not public restroom available that's also appropriate for them. So that is the subject of our next Equity by Design Principles in Action event on May 24th. And you can find information at aarpinternational.org.
Stephanie, could you send us that link? Because this is a really important topic. Just to let you know that Australia's got a big push now to find the best public facilities, right? So really important. We've got one last question and then we're going to start to wrap up. And this is from Brendan Sherlock. And really he's saying older people, all people, should have their choice as to the priority for their type of home to live in. There's an old saying in Ireland. I think it goes, I don't think you can own this, Catherine. I think that this is a global statement, that there is nothing like your own nest, provided it suits your own needs. So if I can just have a quick comment from both of you and then we'll go to wrap up. Catherine and then Stephanie.
Thank you, Jane. Absolutely. And the beauty of Ireland having only 5 million people is that I know Brendan well, and he's been a key contributor to our programme over the last 12 years, a fabulous man living in Fingal. And he's absolutely right. There is a thing about in Ireland, and we have a big history of home ownership, okay, and not more the traditional model of the Europe when you can move into rental. We do like our own place, but I think we're looking differently of what that place is. If it's a modification, if it's a home share, if it's into residential care, whatever the case may be, having your own space, as I say, goes back to that subjectivity. And whatever your nest looks like, it has to be age friendly.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, any comment on the nest?
Yeah, you know, it reminds me, one of the people in the sort of cognitive health community, an architect in that space who I've talked with, one of the things that they say, there are ways to make even when a person does need to move into some kind of a congregate setting or some kind of an assisted living facility, to keep that sense of their space. And so whether it's wallpaper that looks like their front door, that's put on the front door of their room, so that they recognize it and feel that that brings back the memory of their home, or whether it's a shelf outside of their room, their door, that they can decorate with their own kinds of things, so that they not only can recognize their room in a large facility, but also so that they can feel that sense of home. So a lot of the people also want to even move with some of their furniture. Is very dear to them, is very something that they've lived with for a long time. We need to think about this from a human-centric perspective, and not institutionalize people in very vacuous setting, and make it a lot more personal.
Look, thank you. I'm going to come back to each of you for one takeaway message, because we need to close to make sure that people have access to go on to a side event at the UN. But I wanted to just thank both of you for joining with me today in this conversation. It's a critical conversation that needs to be dynamic. We need to continue. Both of you have actually talked about the resources. Don't let's recreate the wheel, because the resources are there and we can adapt them. But both Stephanie and Catherine and their teams have such rich understanding of the needs of older people. So I wanted to also just let you know that the next webinar, IFA AARP special webinar, is on the 19th of April, and we're going to look at COVID-19 and older people, unpacking intersecting inequities affecting older women. And just to actually put in a plug, our next conference in Bangkok next year, one of 4 themes will be on older women, because we believe their voice is not being heard in policy. So I'm going to start with Stephanie. What's your one takeaway message? And then I'll go to Catherine and we'll close down. Stephanie.
I guess my takeaway message is that it is not just the planners and the architects who are thinking about this. It is you. It is all of us who need to be engaging in conversation about ageism, and about our living spaces and our built environment so that they'll work for us. And so it is very easy to start those conversations. And there are, as Jane said, a ton of resources to guide you in thinking about how to frame that conversation and to provide those resources to the people who are influential in those spaces.
And thank you, Stephanie. And once again, thank you for AARP's contribution and presence at the Global Conference and in these webinars. Catherine, the final word.
Thank you, Jane. I suppose what strikes me and the takeaway from this is that we're all doing the same thing. We're all, it doesn't matter what continent you're from, what country you're from. What matters to we as we age is across the world. It's global. So, and the really important thing is that we have to make sure that we're responding, that everybody feels that they have choice. And that's not to say that we have a wish list and everybody gets X, Y, and a Z, but it means that we share the space collectively. But I know, the needs of an older person in West Mayo is probably the same as the needs of somebody in Manitoba, and the same as somebody living on the perimeter of New York, Stephanie, and across all the different countries. And I think what's really important, if we're working together to share that knowledge, and if one does a piece of research that can be transferred to somebody else, very important that we share that and share those learnings so that we are looking at the built environment in its true meaning. And the true meaning of that is, well, why are we doing this? And it's that it has overall health and well-being impact for us all as we age. So that's my takeaway, Jen.
And thank you very much to Stephanie Firestone from AARP and Catherine McGuigan from Age Friendly Ireland, and also to Rashmi Gupta. Good job, Rashmi, for hosting us today, and Berenice Anaya, and also Onda Stanku from the IFA team. So be well, and we'll see you on April the 19th. All the best.
Thank you for having us,
Thank you,
Jane.
Jane.
Thank you.